I feel like by week 10 of this video series, I should have a better way to start them, but I don't. So, hey there. And welcome to the next video in the Intro to Web Dev course series. Yeah, we are 10 weeks in and we've learned a lot. We've learned HTML and CSS and JavaScript. And, depending on how you felt, maybe you liked HTML and hated CSS and felt okay about JavaScript, or loved JavaScript, loved CSS, but HTML is boring, or, any combination. There's a lot of personal preference in coding, and what you enjoy is kind of entirely up to you. And the reason I mention that is because what we're learning about this week, Bootstrap, is a way to not do all of it on your own. Maybe I'll talk more about that later, but this week's lesson is all about something called Bootstrap. So to talk about that, I haven't really prepared, anything. So let me get a replit going. Again, you can use whatever editor you want. If you want to use Atom and work on a local file, that's cool. If you want to use Replit, that's cool. If you want to use something else like CodePen, that's all good too. But I'm just going to get started with an environment. This is a code editor, so I have my code on the left and then my sort of preview in the browser on the right. It's just a way to, work without having to deal with files. So it's just Replit. All right. So what do I got so far? It's just the default. So I'm going to get rid of some of this stuff. I don't really need it. And I'll move this. Actually, I'll get rid of that, I think. I don't necessarily need it. And sure, I hate the horizontal white space issue as always. It wouldn't be a video if I wasn't complaining about something. So whatever, here we are. We have our sort of hello world environment where I have an index.html file and I have my HTML. And you've seen this kind of environment, whether you're using Replit or your own code editor or Atom or whatever. You know how to write HTML and CSS. We haven't touched CSS in a while, but you saw that earlier. So I could, for example, maybe I'll change this to like an h1 tag that's like hello visitor, I don't know. And then maybe a p tag that's welcome to my website. And, it's HTML content, and there it is. And by default, it's not, super pretty. It's not like the most interesting style. It's all kind of the defaults, black on white, and whatever font is the default. But I can change that through CSS. I can maybe style the h1 tag to be color, I don't know, red, maybe font style italic. I never really remember this stuff off the top of my head, but let's see. And sure, that works, right? And I could go through and, even if my website is more, realistic, this is just two tags, but, as I build up my HTML content, I can build out my CSS and it'll work using the concepts that you've already seen. And, you've done that a couple times now, and very likely you have encountered I don't know what to call it, like frustration maybe, or an experience where you want your website to look more like a real website. And I'm putting real in quotation marks because I think there are, I don't know, some societal assumptions about validity in creativity around websites, but that is a whole rant that I'm not going to go down in this video. But you've probably felt like the websites you are creating, it's kind of hard to make them look like a real web page and not a web page created by, whatever word you want to use, a beginner to web development. And the way around that is to learn more about CSS and like really try to make your CSS look like exactly how you want it to look like. But honestly, that can be frustrating in itself, and it's just kind of hard, right? And all of that kind of rambling to say that is where things like Bootstrap can help you. So I'm going to jump back and forth, I think, between like this written tutorial and the code editor, just because this written tutorial has a bunch of code in it that I'm not going to sit here and type because it would make for a really boring video. But I'm just going to switch back and forth between these two tabs a lot. So to talk about Bootstrap at a high level, remember that you've already seen a few things. One thing you've seen is from my index.html file, you've seen how to load a style sheet, a CSS file using the link tag. And that's how you've written CSS already. So that's one thing you've seen, is like loading CSS into your HTML. The other thing you've seen is the idea of a JavaScript library, where you use a script tag to load a JavaScript file that is not necessarily one that you wrote, it's one that someone else wrote. So you've seen those two things already. And Bootstrap is an extension of both of those things. Bootstrap is two things. It is one, it's a CSS file that you can reference from your code without needing to write all of that CSS yourself. The Bootstrap team or whoever they are, they already wrote that CSS for you. So you can just load that CSS file and you get sort of the defaults from Bootstrap. And the second thing that it is a JavaScript library. And they kind of work together, and we'll see, details of how that works in practice as I go through the video. But that's Bootstrap at a high level. It's a CSS file and a JavaScript file. Or you can think of it as a CSS library and a JavaScript library, but it's really just a CSS file and a JavaScript file. So to load Bootstrap, you load both of those things. So I'm going to steal this code from my own tutorial over here. So I'm going to, maybe I'll put it up here in the head section. Doesn't really matter, but I'll put it here. So again, my horizontal white space is my enemy, but this is, 2 lines of code. This is a link tag that loads the Bootstrap CSS file, and it's a script tag that loads the Bootstrap JavaScript file. And now, I don't think it'll make much difference with my, with what I have here, but let's just run it and see what happens. So you see a couple of changes. Maybe I'll get rid of my styling just because that's going to conflict with Bootstrap. So you see a couple changes, like the default font has changed, the default like spacing has changed, but this is just an H1 tag and just a P tag. So it's still like not going to be super different, super interesting. But how Bootstrap sort of works is Bootstrap has defined a bunch of classes that you can use in your HTML to interact with Bootstrap or to trigger Bootstrap styling and behavior from the CSS file and from the JavaScript file. So let me jump down to an example. Let me go back to this. So this is, I'm going to not use Bootstrap for a minute. I'm just going to use some predefined HTML code. And I've used some classes, but I haven't actually loaded any CSS files yet. So these classes won't actually do anything. So it'll be the default styling. So I'm going to run this. And, here it is. Here's the old default HTML styling that you have come to know and love by now. Well, know, probably, love, probably not. But here it is. It's just HTML. It's got some classes on it, but it's just CSS classes, nothing fancy. But so even though I'm using classes, I don't actually load any CSS. So I could right now go over to my style file and write all of the styling code for those classes. I could do that. And that was week 2 or 3 or whatever it was when we learned about CSS. But instead of doing that, because of all of the difficulty that we talked about at the beginning of the video, where getting it to look real is hard. So instead of writing all of that CSS myself, I am going to put back the Bootstrap loading code. So I'm going to load Bootstrap into my web page, and that's the only change I'm going to make. I'm not going to touch anything else. I'm not going to touch the HTML. I'm not going to touch the classes on the HTML. Purely, the only difference is 2 lines of code where I load the CSS and the JavaScript file from Bootstrap. I'm going to run this, and there we go. We have a again, I'm not saying that this is super beautiful or anything, but it's a reasonable set of stylings that apply to your HTML sort of automatically, based on the classes that you have used in your HTML. So I don't know, for example, Bootstrap has a card class, and when you use the card class, it gives you this kind of rounded rectangle thing with a border and some padding and stuff, and then you've got like card header, which gives it like a background, and these are just the defaults, but they're reasonable, right? They look okay, and you could have sat there and came up with CSS that does the same thing, but you don't have to. That's the sort of power of Bootstrap. You don't have to sit there and think about like exactly what shade of gray should this be. You can just use Bootstrap's defaults. So the other thing that Bootstrap gives you is the JavaScript library. So far the thing we saw was mostly styling. This doesn't have any JavaScript functionality. Like if I click this button, it doesn't actually do anything yet. I could write JavaScript that interacts with this button that shows whatever, an alert, or uses DOM manipulation to change the content of the page or whatever. I could write that JavaScript, but again, the sort of power of Bootstrap is you don't have to. So I'm going to go with another example. This time, again, I'm not using Bootstrap. And it's some HTML that has like a button on it, a UL and an LI and a list. Okay, so I'm going to run this and just look at it, and here it is. Here's the output of the unstyled, non-interactive HTML. If I click this, like nothing happens. This is just a list of links. Nothing too interesting, and I could write CSS that makes this into like a dropdown, for example. Like maybe I don't want lions, tigers, and bears to always show up. Maybe I want them to only show up when I click Oh My, the Oh My button, and I want them to show up like in a dropdown style. So I could do that. I could write CSS, that maybe hides this by default, and maybe there's a click listener on the button that like shows the UL when you click the button, and maybe some other styling that makes it look like a drop-down. I could sit here and code that up, and it would use concepts that you have already seen: DOM manipulation, CSS, JavaScript, all that good stuff. But again, why? If I don't have to do that, why bother? So I'm going to keep going back and forth on this code, but now I'm going to add Bootstrap to it. I'm going to load Bootstrap into my web page, and I'm not going to change anything else. And I'm going to run this. And now, because I've loaded Bootstrap, that default styling, that button, now has this like blue styling and it's like rounded corners and stuff. It's got this triangle thing indicating that it's a drop-down. The UL itself is not visible by default, and when I click the button, now the UL is visible, and it's got this nice like outline thing, and it displays as a dropdown. This is now a dropdown, and I can click on these, and these are still links. They don't actually go anywhere, but these could be anything. These could be links to other sections of your web page, or external things, or maybe they have click handlers on themselves and they do other stuff. But the the functionality of converting that HTML into this dropdown component came from Bootstrap. I didn't have to worry about any of that. The only thing I had to do was know which classes to use to like tell Bootstrap how this HTML should behave. And I'll talk about that in a second. I'll talk about how you know what classes to use in a second. Okay, so that is the Bootstrap, like that's an example of the Bootstrap JavaScript part. So when this button is clicked, that triggers some JavaScript code in Bootstrap, and I didn't have to write that. It's kind of it's a JavaScript library, but it kind of automatically works with the classes. And so this is why Bootstrap is both things. It is the CSS that makes it look like a dropdown, and it's the JavaScript that makes it act like a dropdown. So when I click this is triggering JavaScript that's in Bootstrap. Again, we could have written that using the concepts that we've already seen, but we are instead relying on code that Bootstrap already wrote. Okay, so we talked about like the fact that you need to use like special classes to trigger Bootstrap's styling and JavaScript behavior. And so now the next logical question, or like a next logical question anyway, is how the heck do I know what classes to use? Like how did you know that this was dropdown dash item? And the answer to that question, I'm sure if you've been watching these videos and reading through these tutorials, I think you know the answer by now. The whole meta lesson of this class is that coding in general and web development specifically involves a lot of reading documentation and doing searches on search engines and reading through examples and stuff. So that's still true. That's still true in Bootstrap. So a few ways I can do this. Maybe I'll just start out by typing Bootstrap into a search engine, and get Bootstrap is the home page. So I'll go there, and then I'll go to Docs, and you can start reading through. This will introduce Bootstrap in kind of a similar way than that I just did. It's got some more detailed information. But to answer the actual question of how do I know which classes to use, I'll direct you to like the things on the left here. So specifically, you've got like layout, and you've got some different things you can do that I'll come back to in a second. You've got components, which is a big one, which has a bunch of built-in components that are built into Bootstrap that you can use. So here we'll go down to dropdowns, which is what I have over here. And the answer to the question, how did you know what classes to use on your HTML to trigger Bootstrap behavior, is I read this page. And so, here's an example, and it's got the classes kind of built into the example. And so you can see, okay, I need a div that has a class of dropdown, maybe a button with some other classes, and then UL and then LI. And it's not, I didn't know this ahead of time. I came to this page and read it and then copied this over to my code and messed around with it until I had something that accomplished my goal. In this case, showing lions, tigers, and bears in a dropdown. So that was my goal, but you probably have a different goal. But the process is the same. You come here, you read about the examples here, you read about some of the other like maybe more advanced behaviors that you can trigger, and you try something out and you see if it works. And if not, you try something different. Okay, so now we know like this is where you go to get more information about Bootstrap, specifically which classes to use in your HTML. So I could run through a few examples, I guess. Why not? So let's go back to layout, and I'll look at the container, and blah, blah, blah. Here we go. Container. Looks like I can have div class equals container, and I think I actually already did that, in this example. So I've got container here. Let me just remind myself of what this example is. Right, okay. So I'm just going to kind of copy paste this, and yep, this is just another set of code, and I'll run through it, but really all it does is it has the 2 lines of code that load Bootstrap, and then I have a div with a class of container, which I'm getting from the Bootstrap documentation here. And then I've got just some placeholder content. It's lorem ipsum, which is just example text to show you what a web page would look like if it contained a bunch of text. So yeah, let me run this, and And let me play with it this way. So I'm going to pop it out into its own page to show you like one of the features of Bootstrap, and that is the sort of like most external, or like the outermost like layout. So the container that goes around everything. It has these properties that are really helpful in making your website look like, again, in quotation marks, more real. And to show that, I will drag this out into its own window and resize it. And we talked about this in a previous week where we got into layout and like Flexbox and Grid. And we learned about how to make our content respond to different window sizes, different window widths. And, you know, again, we could sit there and write the CSS that does that, but why? Why bother if Bootstrap does it for you? So let me move this window around, and notice that as I resize my window, the content kind of snaps to these sort of predefined widths. And again, we could have debated with ourselves like exactly when should our content snap and like what should it snap to, but people at Bootstrap already put a lot of thought into exactly how wide your content should be, and you know, it works. So that's the container component or container layout in Bootstrap. It's really this snapping behavior, and there's very likely other things you can do. I haven't actually read this whole thing, but you can read more about it here and get more information. But that's sort of the outermost building block of Bootstrap, is that container div. Other than that, let's see. So here's another example that I can run through real quick. Another thing that you might have tried is creating your own like navigation, like your nav bar at the top. And I've said this before, and it's probably getting annoying to hear me say it. Like, we could sit here and style a nav bar. I think I did that in a previous video. But Bootstrap has its own nav bar. So let me go to Components and nav bar here, and you can read all about it. You can get a ton more information, and look at how involved this first example is. You've got all these different things that have a bunch of styling and like behavior, and like this drop down has other stuff inside of it. And again, we could sit here and do that. It's not using any concepts that you don't already know, but somebody like went through the trouble of doing it for you. So this example is kind of complicated. I think if you scroll down, you'll get like smaller examples. I think they maybe just started with the most complicated one, and then they kind of build their way up. So maybe this is a little bit more reasonable. So let me go back to the example, and this is it's HTML that has some HTML elements in it, and each of those elements has a set of classes on it. Those classes came from the Bootstrap documentation, and they trigger styling and behavior that comes from Bootstrap. So let me save this and run this, and maybe I'll go back to my full page example here. And here it is. And I'm not saying that this is the most beautiful website on the face of the planet. It's probably not the most interesting website on the face of the planet, but it's reasonable. It's in giant quotation marks, real. It looks a little bit more like a website that you might just encounter in the world. And it's got some other kind of default behaviors. So as I resize the window, when the window is very wide, the nav bar is this kind of horizontal layout. But as I make my window skinnier, it snaps to like this vertical layout. And, imagine you're on a phone. Maybe you don't have enough room to show all of the links in a horizontal layout like that. And so you want to show it vertically so that you can see each link by itself on your phone. So you've got that kind of default behavior coming from Bootstrap without needing to worry about like where your screen break limits should be, and it just kind of works. you know, you can customize it, and I would encourage you to read through this page to get, you know, a ton more information about all the different things you can do. You can do things like have this button, so your nav is like collapsible, and you know, it only shows up when you click it. You can make it so that only shows up on phones, which is a pretty popular design strategy or whatever, to kind of hide things under menus on mobile. And you can do all of that without needing to worry too much about the styling and the JavaScript yourself. It kind of just comes for free from Bootstrap. Okay, so that's navigation. I think I'll just mention one more thing that's kind of a staple of Bootstrap, and that is their grid system. So remember way back when we learned about Flexbox and Grid, and again, you could play with that. You could sit here and put together your page layout using Flexbox and Grid, but again, Bootstrap already did that. So Bootstrap has its own mobile first Flexbox Grid, blah, blah, blah. It has its own layout, which behind the scenes uses Flexbox and Grid, but kind of wraps it in this nicer behavior, or this nicer set of classes. So maybe I'll steal this code and go back to my example. Sure. I don't remember if I already copied container or not. We'll find out. So I did. Okay, cool. So I've got my is that right? Did I line that up right? Close enough. So nothing much has changed. I'm still loading the Bootstrap library in my head section with both the CSS and the JavaScript, and then I have some HTML tags that have classes on them. So I'm just going to run this, and notice, or maybe just read through this kind of section by section. What I have is a single div. Well, first of all, I have the container, which is what we talked about before, that has that like snapping behavior, where it snaps to specific widths as you resize the window. And then inside of that container, I have right now a single row. And then inside of that row, I have 3 columns. And I'm using, you saw me, I just straight up copied the code from the example. But what that gives me is these 3 columns of content. So maybe to show that a little bit better, maybe I'll specify some of my own styling. So, whoops, I deleted something. Yeah. So I'm going to have a script tag, and this isn't really part of Bootstrap. Well, we'll talk about this in a second, but I'm doing this just to be able to show it a little bit better. So I'm going to maybe specify that the col class has a border that is 2 pixels solid black. And I want to run that. No. Okay, well, here you go. Okay, I've got a syntax error, and this is normal. This always happens when you're coding. You're often going to get, errors. Let me move that up in case my dumb face is hiding it. So I've got this syntax error. This is my JavaScript console, and so when I encounter an error like this, I'm going to read it. First of all, syntax error, unexpected token dot. So okay, the browser is reading my code, and it read a dot and was like, I didn't expect to see a dot here. That's not valid syntax. And it's on line 8. Okay, so let me go to line 8, which is my CSS that I just created. And okay, now I'm staring at this sort of section. I can see that I meant to have a style tag here, and I accidentally typed script. So I'm going to change that to style. And so the error is saying, you told me this was going to be JavaScript, but it's not, because it starts with a dot, and what are you trying to do there? Because CSS uses a different syntax than JavaScript does, I had to tell it like, hey, heads up, this is about to be CSS. So that's why I needed the style tag. So let me run this now. And okay, now we're back to the races. So now you can see that each column it kind of has a border that I just added just to be able to make it a little bit more visible. And by default, each of those columns is going to take up the same like percentage of the available row, but you can change that. So again, I'm not volunteering this information straight out of my brain. I read this page literally yesterday to like remind myself of how this all worked. So I just read through this, looked at the examples, and honestly, this is where all of this information is coming from. So like, I don't want it to seem like I am an expert in Bootstrap who knew all of this stuff ahead of time and am some kind of, you know, expert that has knowledge that you don't have access to. I straight up got it from this page. So I'll just kind of walk through some of the takeaways from this page. I recommend reading it, but some of the takeaways that I got from it are, you know, you can lay out your page using rows and columns, and by default, each column is going to take up the same amount of width. So if I have 3 columns, each column is going to take up 1/3 of the available space. So they're equal widths. But you can change that by using a different class, and it's col dash and then a number between 1 and 12. And I'll talk about why it's between 1 and 12 after this, but let me maybe just do this, and let me change this to include what I just used. Okay, this is purely just to be able to see it, but let me run that and see what happens. And so now notice that my first column takes up some amount of width, my third column takes up that same amount of width, and the middle column takes up more. I happen to know that column, this second column, in fact, maybe I'll say like column 1 and column 3, just to make them a little easier to talk about. So column 2 takes up half of the available width. This column is 50% of the size of the available space, and then column 1 takes up the same amount as column 3, and they just take up the remaining half. So each of those is going to be like 25%. And the reason for this is something called template columns, and this is kind of a bootstrappy concept, but it means that Bootstrap splits up the container into 12 units, and then you can use the col dash number syntax to tell Bootstrap how many of those units a column should take up. So this is getting into some of the grid layout stuff, but you don't really have to think too hard about all of the grid properties. It's kind of hidden behind this col dash whatever. If you don't have a dash, it'll just take up the rest of the space, split evenly between all of the cols. But if you do specify it, it will use that 12 number. So let me demonstrate that maybe by saying like, this is going to be col 1, this will be 2, and this will be 3. And let me just add those up here just so we can see them. Col 2, col 3. Okay, let me run that. And, you know, it's kind of gross looking because I made the 1 like super tiny, but notice that this 1 takes up 1 kind of unit or template column. And then the second one, because it takes up 2 units, it's two of those widths. So if this is, let's say, I don't know, about 100 pixels here, this is about 200 pixels. I'm eyeballing that. I don't know exactly how many pixels it is, but let's just say that for round number. This is twice as big as that first one, and this third one is 3 times as big as that first one. And here, the other thing to point out is also notice that my columns, they didn't stretch the full width, and that's because I specifically specified this is only 1 unit, this is 2 units, and this is 3 units. So I don't know, I can maybe take out the 2 here, which will tell Bootstrap that the leftmost one should take up 1 unit, 1 template column. The third one should take up 3, and give the rest of the space to the middle, without worrying too much about exactly what those widths are going to be. Bootstrap will lay it out in a relatively reasonable way. So I'll run that, and again, my first column is a little goofy because it's super tiny, but I didn't have to worry about percentages or anything. This is all Bootstrap doing its thing. So maybe I'll jump to like the payoff of why that matters. I'd suggest reading through some of these other examples to get more information, but talking through it I think is going to be not super useful. So I recommend reading through this grid page and reading through some of these examples, but I'm just going to jump to maybe like a more like realistic example. So let me just steal this code and let's talk about it for a second. So this code has, first I am loading Bootstrap, and then I have a container which has that snapping behavior, and then I have a row. I think this example only has a single row. Yeah. So I've got a single row, and that class, that row is going to contain a couple columns. First, it has a column, looks like it's going to contain a left nav, and it's going to take up 2 of those units, of those template columns. Okay, so that's the column, and then that column contains a left nav, a UL and stuff. Okay, so then I have another column. It looks like this has just col, so it's going to take up whatever remaining space is left over after the more specific columns. And this looks like it has some main content. So it's maybe like the center of the page. And then I've got a div, another column, a third column, which is going to take up 4 units or template columns. It looks like it has like just another nav type thing. Okay, so that's the content. And so let me run that and see what it looks like. And I might have broken something. Let's find out. Let me refresh, maybe. Let me refresh over here. Okay, I don't know why this preview is being weird. Maybe I'll just refresh the whole thing. But while I wait on that, I'll just go over here. It's just the rendered HTML in a new tab. And this is what we're working with. We have a left nav here, and it's got some links, and it's got some content, and that content kind of automatically wraps. And then I've got the main content of the page, which takes up however much space it needs to, or whatever is left over. And then I have a right nav, which has its own set of content. And this is kind of an arbitrary example, but you can imagine how you might use this to create a more, again, in gigantic quotation marks, like real web page, where you have a left nav, a main content area, and a right nav, and you can build on it. Maybe you add the nav bar to the top as well, and maybe you have like a footer down at the bottom using combination of the things we've already learned and like the components in Bootstrap, and you would you'd be able to put together a pretty realistic looking web page without worrying too much about the specifics of exactly how to style your CSS and all that stuff. I'll also just pause and say that there's a weed whacker outside of my door, or leaf blower, I guess. I live in an apartment complex that is just straight up obsessed with their lawn area. It's very annoying. I hope you can't hear it too much on the video, but this is the joys of teaching from home. Okay, so I'm just about done. I ran through a couple examples of specific Bootstrap components that you can use, grid and the nav bar and the container, but there are a ton more. And don't limit yourself to what I have told you about. Go through and read these, and maybe you want a carousel and read through these examples, and I don't know, this looks cool. This looks like maybe you can have like images or something and have people interact with your carousel of images, and it's this much code to get all of that working. And honestly, you can probably mostly copy paste it and like change this source here and get that working and see how it all fits together, and build from there and combine multiple, and that's how you sort of build your page. So yeah, I've talked about the components, but really the meta lesson is go here to the documentation for Bootstrap and teach yourself more about exactly which classes to use to trigger specific behaviors. Okay, so the last thing I want to mention is, custom styling and themes. Okay, so let me maybe go all the way down there and steal some code. That's a spoiler alert. Spoiler alert for the beautiful styling. I'm going to go back to this example, this the first one we saw, which shows this kind of card UI. So I'm going to run this, and here's my my Bootstrap card. Let me just see what that looks like in the main page. Here it is. Again, not saying it's the most exciting thing in the world, but it's reasonable looking depending on what your goal is. You could maybe combine this with the row and column layout to make it take up maybe a certain amount of width or a certain amount of space, but by default it's just going to stretch. So fine, here is the sort of default styling that Bootstrap gives you. Cool. But you're not bound to that. Just because you're using Bootstrap doesn't mean that you can't do any styling yourself. So you can add more styles to it. So there's a few ways to do that, and this goes back to our lesson on CSS, but I could load my own script file, or my own style file. Maybe I'll do that. Link href equals style.css, and then do I need rel equals style sheet? I don't even know, honestly, but let's just find out. Style sheet singular. So I think what this is going to do is load my style file. Maybe I will, we'll find out in a second. So maybe what I want to do is take this, this card body class, which has some styling on it from Bootstrap, and you can actually right click and find out if you really want to. It's going to get really messy, but you can kind of stalk the Bootstrap styling by inspecting the elements and seeing where am I going, card body, and here you go. You can see the styles that Bootstrap adds to it by default, and that's all good, but I want my card body to be a little bit more interesting, so I'm going to write my own CSS that styles that class. It's a CSS class, so you are free to customize it. So maybe I want a background color of eye searing red. I'm going to run this and see what happens. And there you go. So you can customize the default style that Bootstrap gives you using your own CSS. You can override the styles that are in the Bootstrap classes themselves. And this gets at the concept of cascading and overriding. So Bootstrap has its own set of stylings on this class, and you can add your own, and it cascades together. And you can even override the styling that Bootstrap provides. So if you want to change this button background to something else, you can. So that's why we mentioned cascading and overriding all the way at the beginning, is because it comes in handy for things like this, where you're using some CSS library and you want to customize it. So you can certainly, customize the Bootstrap styling this way through your own CSS. The other thing I want to mention, so I'm just going to delete that and go back to the default. The other thing I want to mention is the concept of Bootstrap Themes. And this is the idea that, by default, we loaded the Bootstrap CSS, and this provides some reasonable set of defaults that Bootstrap uses. But, those defaults are kind of restrictive. They're kind of boring. You've got this kind of default light style with, rounded borders and all that good stuff. And that is reasonable. It's a reasonable default, but you're not stuck with that. So I don't know, the way I would do it is go to a search engine and type in Bootstrap Themes. And there's a bunch of different ways to do it. So Bootstrap, I think the way they make money is by selling themes. So these cost money, and if you're making a professional website, maybe they're worth checking out. But there's also a website called Bootswatch, I think this is the right one, Bootswatch, which offers some free themes for Bootstrap. And you can go through here and pick out one that you like. This has got a cool like blue kind of motif. This is pink and kind of cool looking. And there's a bunch. And at the end of the day, these are CSS files. So let me maybe just look at this in a new tab. Well, this worker is going to force me to download it. No, it works. So this is a CSS file. And that's what Bootstrap is at its core. It's a CSS file and a JavaScript file. And a theme, a Bootstrap theme, is a different CSS file. Now the CSS file, it contains CSS that styles the classes that Bootstrap uses, but at the end of the day, it's just a CSS file. So I don't know, for example, what does this have? What class does this have? Like card body, or just card. So let me do like a Control F for card. And here's the CSS that styles the card class. And you've got like card HR, which is like the horizontal rule. You've got all kinds of stuff inside the card. And this is what Bootstrap, like by default, gives you, the core like default Bootstrap CSS file. But this is just a different set of styles for the same classes. So let me copy this URL and go back to my code. And the only thing I'm going to change, so check it out, check out my default styled card. The only thing I'm going to change is, instead of loading the default Bootstrap CSS file, I'm going to load that theme CSS file. So I'm loading the, in this case, I think it was called Cyborg. Okay, so let me save that and run this. And again, Replit is being kind of goofy today. It's not cooperating. Oh, there it is, but I just refreshed. Okay, so 1 second. Let me run it. And let me give up and go over here and refresh. And here you go. We went from the default light styling to this dark theme, and the only thing we had to change was one line of code, and that line of code is the line of code that loads the Bootstrap CSS. Instead of loading the default, I load the theme CSS file. So if you want to play around with that, that's another way to customize the stylings that CSS or that Bootstrap gives you. You're also free to combine both of those things. So maybe you start with a theme and then you also override some of the styles. So I could go back here and say, what was it, like card body, background color red. I think this will work. There you go. So, this is a terrible UI. This is going to cause people to have headaches and to not be able to deal with your website. So don't choose this exact styling combination. But you can customize the theme to your liking exactly the same way that you could customize the theme from the default. So whatever, you can play with it that way. Okay, I think that's about as far as I'm going to go on Bootstrap. I think that's the gist of it. So to summarize, what I'll say is, are you sick of writing CSS yourself? Are you sick of writing JavaScript yourself? If so, then do I have the library for you? It's called Bootstrap. And in 2 lines of code, and through a healthy amount of looking at the Bootstrap documentation, you get these kind of like complex behaviors and complex like components and layouts without needing to worry about any of that yourself. You still need to know what rules to use, but that's what the documentation is for. Yeah, so that's Bootstrap in a nutshell. I think I will ramble for just a minute about, I don't know, some of the philosophical debates behind Bootstrap. So, Bootstrap is a tool. It's a good tool, and I spent the last hour or so talking about why it's a good tool, what makes it a good tool. I'll also say that I don't want you to feel like you need to use Bootstrap. Now, this week you do need to use Bootstrap. That's the assignment. But more generally, as you complete this class and you think about creating your own web pages, Bootstrap is one option, but I honestly, maybe I'll just speak about my own experience. Back when I first started learning about web dev, I was really frustrated by like, how do I make my web page look realistic or like a real website instead of from someone who doesn't really know what they're doing? And my layout was never quite right. It was always like a few pixels off, and I really struggled with it. And then I found Bootstrap, and it seemed to solve a lot of problems for me. And, in a lot of ways it did. But that was back in like 2015. And since then, I think that HTML and CSS and JavaScript, they've grown quite a bit. So things like Flexbox and things like grid layout and, those kinds of things that we've already learned about, they've come a long way in the last few years. So for me personally, I have actually stopped using Bootstrap for my own web pages. I do think it's a handy thing to know about for two reasons. One, it's very popular. It's still very popular. I think it might be the most popular like UI library out there. So, if you are learning web development and you're trying to get your CSS to look, again, quotation marks, real, you'll almost certainly encounter Bootstrap, and you'll almost certainly encounter pages that are made with Bootstrap. So, that's the first reason. It's just kind of inescapable. And the second reason is a little bit philosophical, but that is, I don't actually want you to only learn Bootstrap. I almost said I don't want you to learn Bootstrap, but like, I want you to learn Bootstrap. But the real lesson here is not, here's Bootstrap, here's the classes you can use. I don't really want you to memorize those classes. I don't want you to like feel like you need to know each and every component in Bootstrap, because more importantly, what you're doing is going through documentation and reading about how things work and what rules you need to follow, what syntax you need to write, and then trying that out in your own editor, previewing that in your HTML, seeing what works, seeing what you like, and applying the rules that way. And the reason that's important is because those concepts or those skills apply no matter what you're using. So Bootstrap is one UI library or UI toolkit or framework, whatever word you want to use. There are a ton more. I didn't plan this part of it. Obviously, I never do. But I don't know, UI toolkits. If I do a search, there's just going to be so many options. So maybe I'll narrow it down to like web development UI toolkits. And again, there are just so many. And as you write your own web pages, or if you get a job that involves creating web pages, you'll likely encounter other frameworks. And, even if you've never seen that specific framework before, doesn't matter, because you know the skills. You know that how you work with a framework is by searching the name of that framework. In our case, it happened to be Bootstrap, but fill in the blank, whatever framework you're using, find the documentation for it, find tutorials for it, and read more information, go to their docs, go to their examples, and try stuff out. And that process will apply to any framework that you encounter in your web development career. So yeah, whether you use Bootstrap after this course, after these videos, it's up to you. I actually encourage you to try writing your own HTML and CSS. I would say that a little CSS goes a long way, and I think maybe I'll make a separate video talking about what I mean by that. But you don't necessarily need Bootstrap to make a realistic looking website. But at this point, I'm going to leave it up to you. If Bootstrap makes your life easier, then cool, go for it. It's a tool, and if you're in this course, you have to spend the next few days working with it. But after that, it's personal preference. Do you prefer using Bootstrap and frameworks like that, or do you prefer having sort of more control and more understanding of what's happening behind the scenes? And that's personal preference. Okay, I think that's enough rambling from me. I'll leave it there. And so the takeaways, again, are Bootstrap is a CSS file and a JavaScript library. You can load those into your HTML and then use the Bootstrap documentation to know which classes to use to trigger Bootstrap behavior. And you can customize that either using your own CSS or a theme file. And other than that, check out the documentation. Those are the takeaways. All right, I think that's it for me. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next one. And until then, happy bootstrapping.